So ICMA wanted people to approach emergency management as an administrative challenge, and FEMA pushed the notion that if you got your community ready ahead of time, the challenges you'd face during the disaster would be less. And this lesson was really learned from flooding, where they recognized that if people didn't build in the floodplain to begin with, that solved a big part of the problem. If they did in fact live in the floodplain, if their house was raised, then the amount of damage was minimized. The loss of life was minimized. If people lived on the edge of the floodplain and they knew how to properly sandbag their property, they could minimize damage and eliminate loss of life. So FEMA had many courses that were taught as a train-the-trainer basis to emergency managers to go out and begin to train their community. And that culminated in the CERT program. Now, CERT has kind of an interesting lineage. It started in Japan. After the 1926 earthquake, the Japanese government mandated that every household had to keep in the foyer or entranceway where they leave their shoes a bucket of sand and a broom and a hat, because their big concern from earthquakes is fires. In the 1926 earthquake, very few people were killed by building collapse, but thousands and thousands died of asphyxiation because of the huge fires that raged across Tokyo. So fighting the fire after the earthquake became the big focus in Japan. And when I was living there in the late 70s and early 80s, what they called mayor of the neighborhood, or the most senior resident man of the neighborhood, would go around and pay a cheerful visit to every homeowner and just make sure that in the vestibule there was in fact a bucket of sand and a broom and a hat. And then they evolved to include some other emergency response capabilities, like having portable amounts of water that you could take with you if you had to flee, and some first aid. And by the time I lived there, the kit they required was fairly sophisticated. So in California, we didn't have too many earthquakes in the beginning part of the 20th century. We had the 1906 in San Francisco, which of course is famous. We had the 1933 in Long Beach, which is not as famous, but is really more important because out of that came the Field Act. And then we had the 1971 in Sylmar. And there were some smaller quakes. There was one in the 60s in Morgan Hill, and so forth, that were more localized in their damage. But they were fairly widely spaced. And California developed in World War II through the military-industrial complex, and then through the 60s in aerospace, more and more population, more and more economic engine, and completely ignoring the fact that the restless faults were underneath the area. And then came Sylmar, 1971, and houses broke in two, and they recognized that it was fine to go by the Field Act concept of no unreinforced masonry buildings, but that even if you built sticks and stucco, you needed to build it in a way that was more seismically resistant, more capable of withstanding shaking. And so the building officials of California became very, very active in building code design. And some of them worked with their emergency managers. So when I was in Irvine, Bob Storkheim was our building official, and he was the president of California Building Officials for some time. And he worked really closely with me. He'd come down and ask me questions about earthquakes and seismic and tectonic information. And then he'd go back and think about how that would impact the way a building was built. And he and I climbed around under buildings and took pictures, and we went out to building construction sites and looked at the changes and how the straps were put in and what a shear wall was. And we made public education videos to show in our community meetings. So all of this kind of thing was going on all around the state of California as people developed a recognition that this was a problem. In 1986, Dick Andrews was the deputy for emergency management in the state, and he put on a huge conference at the Queen Mary in Long Beach on earthquake preparedness. And so far as I know, 1986 was really the birth of emergency management as we know it today in California, when the state expected every community to engage in public education, to bring the community members into the effort to prepare, to try to get people to make kits, to begin doing regular training, not just the occasional earthquake month talk on the TV, but something that went on throughout the year. So in 1983, we had the Coalinga earthquake. And that's what got the state's attention. That's what generated the Long Beach Conference. But meanwhile, in Sunnyvale and in Los Angeles, some very proactive people said, we need to get our community ready. And in each case, they had some knowledge of the Japanese plan for each household being responsible to put out its own fire after an earthquake. And so independently and on two very different tracks, SNAP was developed here in Sunnyvale, and CERT was developed in Los Angeles. And in Orange County, the Red Cross began a program called NEST, Neighborhood Emergency Support Teams. So these were going on independently, and I'm sure many other communities had started. I know here in Cupertino, the schools were very active, and Senator Elaine Alquist was one of the parents in the PTA that provided funding and leadership to help to get that started. And the emergency manager for the city of Cupertino began working very closely with schools. And so the genesis of community preparedness in Cupertino was schools. So each community had their own approach, but there was a recognition that we couldn't just sit back and wait for the next earthquake and see what happened, because we'd had enough examples now in 71 and 83 to see exactly what would happen. CERT began to then be spread around the state by the Los Angeles Fire Department through the fire service. And eventually the San Francisco Fire Department developed NERT, Neighborhood Emergency Response Teams, in the Bay Area and began offering train the trainers for free in various areas around here. So San Jose was one of the cities. Paul Garrett went and took that training and came back and agreed that it was something we should do in San Jose. Then we had to get money. So this is the track that all of us followed. Now we had a good program. Now we had something that was more regularized across regions at least. But who was going to pay for the staff time and the cost of the equipment? And so fortunately, Sam Eisenberg at FEMA heard about the Los Angeles program, had the guys come back from LA Fire to do a talk and to offer a class as part of their normal rotation of various advanced emergency management class trainings. And FEMA adopted CERT. So then, instead of having this sort of patchwork of some communities with robust programs that didn't match each other and other communities doing little or nothing, we now had a unified approach. And so in the first period, CERT became a nationwide effort, and in order to try to spread it, there were some financial inducements. So San Jose was the first city in the country to get the $500 inducement, because every time you offered a complete set of CERT classes, they would reimburse you up to $500 for your out-of-pocket cost. And so being a big city and having a small budget, we jumped right on it. And Angela was our emergency management coordinator by then, and she really carried the torch for CERT and carried it throughout San Jose, and other people in our county had that same kind of spirit and went out and spread CERT, so that today we have every city in Santa Clara County with CERT capabilities, CERT trained citizens, and we know the difference that has made. So that was a big step forward in the response piece.